Struggling to discuss sex and intimacy with your partner?
Not feeling met, seen, or heard in your relationships?
I'm Janelle.
And I'm Andrea. We're two midlife mavericks sharing our own experiences.
Messy AF and no regrets.
With
Hey,
marriage,
Bravehearts,
divorce,
looking for permission?
polyamory,
Work with
and
us.
pleasure. We offer
We've learned
Braveheart
that when
coaching.
you're brave enough
Follow
to
us
figure
on
out what you
Instagram.
want,
Meet us
and
in
ask
real
for
life
it,
at a Braveheart
with partners,
conversation. Friends,
subscribe
family,
to our newsletter.
and most importantly, do all this and more at our website.
You'll feel more alive and free.
permissiontobehuman.live. Question everything, especially your mother's advice.
There's no rom-com formula for this, but don't panic.
Being alone matters. Honey, I can't miss you if you don't leave.
What if your breakup could be your breakthrough?
Our podcast is for Bravehearts.
Anyone who seeks or has found the courage to confront their fears and limiting beliefs about breaking societal norms in the spirit of finding their truth.
If you're seeking permission to be brave in your relationships
and want to feel less alone along the way,
we got you.
Hi, Andrea.
Hi, Janelle. Welcome to Permission to be Human, y'all.
Yeah, season 3.
We're so excited to be here.
Yes, we've taken a little break. We have spent a lot of time actually thinking, reflecting, strategizing, evaluating what this season was all about. And as we've evolved over the past 2 years, 75 episodes, we've realized that the most common themes across the Permission to be Human is learning to be brave in relationships.
Yeah, and we think we know what you want because across our Braveheart conversations that have happened in real life, we have discovered a lot of fascinating and common questions among Bravehearts.
Mm-hmm. And so we've decided that season 3 is going to be all about going deep into these questions.
And that means every 3 months, we'll ask one question across 12 episodes. We will interview each other, we'll interview experts, and we will interview Bravehearts so that we can be brave in relationships together, one crisis, one celebration, one late night conversation at a time.
Mm-hmm. And this format is inspired by our Braveheart coaching model. We want to bring the permission and the depth that we bring to individuals to everyone.
So the first question we'll cover is, ready?
Drum roll, please.
Yep. How do I talk to my partner about sex and intimacy? That came up so much. Yes. Let's dive in. Mm-hmm. So I am interviewing Janelle first, and here we go. So Janelle, tell me about your journey with this conundrum.
With the question. Yes. Okay, so just as a recap, everyone, I was married. I'm divorced now. But when my husband and I first got together, almost 10 years ago, it was the best sex of my life. And we started out monogamous. We switched to non-monogamous and polyamorous along the way. But our sex life also started to shift. And ultimately, I wanted more sex than he did. And that was hard.
Yep. I think we can relate to that, right? Right, Bravehearts? So let's first ask, how do you define sex here?
So way back when in my life, right? I used to think of sex as like penetration, P and the V, high school term, right? And it was orgasm focused. And one of the gifts of becoming polyamorous was that we learned a lot about communication. It was one of the gifts of that, of like learning about our own desires and learning how to communicate them. And our communication around our sex life wasn't always in ease, but we were always working on it. And we had a couples therapist thinking that we were setting ourselves up for success.
Right.
Because we knew that polyamory was like an edge and hard, and neither one of us had done it before.
Right.
So we wanted the support to help us navigate that. And so that was some of the things we had in place to help us.
Okay. All right. So, but you defined the sex as penetration. And it sounds like that definition may have changed a little bit, but we'll come back to that. So I want to go back to the story. So like, when then did things change? Like if you were having the best sex of your life, and then you became polyamorous and it was still great and you were having sex with other people. And then what happened?
As soon as we got married, literally on our honeymoon,
Marriage.
things changed. When it was like day or 3 or 4 and we had not had sex yet, I finally asked him about it. And the shame of going on our honeymoon and not having sex, like, was worse than like, help me overcome the fear of actually asking him about sex.
Right.
And so I
Yeah.
asked him and we had sex.
And how was it?
And it was okay, right? I mean, it was fine. But I what I remember now in my heart more was the like, oh, we weren't having it and hadn't had it, we got there. I also want to say, like, even like part of the journey of a brave heart, right, is really going inward. And if I'm really honest with myself, right, I say like, oh, it started right on our honeymoon. But really, truly, it started prior to that, like that I recognized we had a difference in our sex life. But I was under the impression that like we would fix it, or it would change, or it would evolve, or it's not that big of a deal. But like the signs were there. I just didn't want to look at the signs. Like I wanted to get married to this like really incredible man.
Oh my gosh, so much to ask about there. So, and I think it's fair to say like, or it's reasonable to say that, okay, so the sex was like missing, or you had different sex drives, it sounds like, right?
Yeah.
But everything else was really great. You got along and you had overlapping interests and you loved each other and there was just so many other things that were good. So I can see that being like, all right, well, like things might change. But I also want to go back to really the root of what we're asking about today is, how do I talk to my partner about sex and intimacy? And on your honeymoon, you summoned the courage to be like, hey, like we haven't had sex yet. So, I mean, you did it there. Can I just dig a little bit deeper into like how you managed to say that? I don't even know if I would have been able to. Like, I know what you mean about the shame of the honeymoon without sex, but you know, that's big.
Yeah, I would say that the shame of not having sex on the honeymoon was a big one for me, like a big motivator. Also deeply confusing and like, what's going on here? And and again, like it's not that we didn't have any tools. You know, we had some tools and I knew enough about myself. I mean, we had been dating at that point for 5 years, right? And had been polyamorous for many of those, to be like, okay, I have to speak what's true for me, you know, and like the culmination, the culmination and the result of it was like I didn't force him to have sex with me. Like he chose to have sex with me. He wanted to have sex with me, even though there was other things going on.
Yeah.
Right. But it's, you know, it wasn't like a forced hand, but I was the one who was initiating.
And did you usually initiate in the past?
I would say yes. What I would say is because it was I was the one who had more of a sex drive. And I also want to say now, in hindsight, I mean, Bravehearts also, like, you know, this is a conversation, like a vulnerable conversation that Andrea and I are having in real life right now, right? And as I'm like, you know, we have some points that we're talking about, but like there's parts of myself that I'm just like remembering and revealing in real time. And like I had this idea of like what my sex life was supposed to look like, how often we were supposed to have sex, how like what orgasm was supposed to be like. I just had this idea of what it was supposed to be, like very much of the mind, very much of the culture. And so I was the one who was initiating, but in a way, I don't know that my husband didn't have a high sex drive. I just don't think that the way I was like wanting it in the way that I did was a turn on for him.
Mm-hmm. Oh, there's so much there too. So, I mean, I'm hearing you say mind, culture, expectations, supposed to look a certain way. And you were pretty focused on that. You're like, oops, something's off here. It doesn't look like it's supposed to
Mm-hmm.
look. And how was it
Mm-hmm.
supposed to look? Like, where did you get that idea?
Whether it's movies, rom-coms, TV, other friends, people describing their sex lives with their partners. I mean, probably also like books.
Right, right.
Um,
But, and you thought, no, that's what mine should look like too, right?
yeah, I mean, at least like sex a couple times a week,
Right,
and
right,
right, and when you have sex, there should be orgasms,
right.
and then also like what were my desires, right? Oh, I do. There were things that I definitely had. I had natural desires for sex, but along the way, what we figured out too is that we had different definitions of sex and intimacy.
Mm. You had different definition. You and your husband had different definitions of sex and intimacy.
Mm-hmm.
And so how were those different?
So I actually strongly associated sex to intimacy. Like I felt like we were closer when we had sex.
Yeah,
And
makes sense.
turns out my husband didn't,
Huh.
right? And I wanted his love and intimacy to be expressed physically during sex,
Mm-hmm.
and for him intimacy came in other ways.
Other form.
Yeah. And he thought we were being intimate all the time, right? We were
Wow.
doing everything together. He was the person he spoke to most. He spent most of his time with me.
Right.
We were living life together. We were living together. We were starting businesses together. We were traveling together. We were like having big conversations about family and about money and like values and life and dreams. And he
Right.
was like, we're so intimate.
And so this is fascinating too, because so much of what I read about sex or is in pop culture about sex is that, well, intimacy starts outside the bedroom, right? Like you have to like be intimate in your normal life, and that is going to fuel your sex life. But you're saying that was working. That
Mm-hmm.
was working well. You were connecting.
Right. Outside of the bedroom, we were
Mm-hmm.
in deep conversations a lot. Another thing about polyamory, right? There's a joke that like you end up processing a lot. You actually don't have sex very much because you're processing so much. And
So
there was a
true.
truth, and there was a truth to that.
Oh my God.
But we were, learning about ourselves and learning about each other and learning about our desires.
Right.
And I remember, so he and I met on OkCupid. And that's algorithm based. And when we met, we had a 97% compatibility. And so I remember a
Uh-huh.
conversation that he and I had, and he was like, "This is like our one area that we're not like the compatibility is off. It's like just 3%.
Right.
Like, why do we have to spend so much time focusing on this 3% when there's 97% that's compatible?"
Okay. So fair enough. But I think it sounds like it was a challenge, and the resolution part of your resolution was like, how do you define sex? How do you define intimacy? And
Yes.
and defining that for each of you, maybe on your own, and then coming together to discuss it. Is that
Yes.
what happened?
Yep, that is what happened. And also, like, even understanding that, like, oh, he works better in definitions, I work better in examples.
Right.
So it was like, okay, here's an example where I felt really intimate. Here's an example where I felt like this is what sex meant to me, right?
Yeah.
And, um, but I'll say, I spent a couple of years trying to come to terms with just saying, oh, okay, like it's okay that this 3%, like that our sex life is just in this 3% category, and so it isn't that important.
So it sounds like you ask
And
yourself, you're like, well, maybe it's okay. Maybe we don't have to have sex.
right, so even if we had a different definition of it, like so here's his definition, here's my definition, but then also then how important is it
Yeah.
was the other
Yeah.
piece.
Exactly. And I also hear too, I think it's important to bring up that something I think I've learned from you, even though I know it deep down, is that there is no right and wrong way to think about sex and intimacy.
Correct.
Like the way that he was thinking about it is his way, based on his
Yeah.
personality and his cultural conditioning and his experiences
And his desires.
and his desires, right?
Yeah.
And someone else might think of it very differently. And
Right.
that's okay. Like there is no, like, I think I used to think, well, yeah, but like this is like the right way, right? Like these other things are like off in the, you know, too different. And telling Bravehearts out there, I'm like, no, it doesn't, like, as long as there, I used to say is like, as long as there's kindness and consent, then however you think about sex and intimacy is fine. Whatever works for you.
Yeah. Yeah. But I would say that in the journey, before I became like more aware and did all the work, is right. Like I was definitely blaming.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Like I like that was, I was like, I want it to be my way.
Oh, really? Me too.
So it wasn't that easy to be like, like, oh, we all have our own ways. When I was like, I want it.
Mine's best. Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So the resolution. So define what sex and intimacy means and how much you want it and how much of an attraction or part of your life you want it to be. I think that's an important part. So what happened next?
So after about a year of infrequent sex, he shared that he no longer desired to have sex with me.
So fucking hard.
Yeah. Really fucking hard. It was really fucking hard to hear. And, he said his desire was tied to feeling seen, and that he didn't feel seen by me, which, interestingly is communication related. His experience was that I didn't listen, I didn't hear him, I interrupted him. Energetically, something felt like I was eating him. And all of those things tied to his sense of desire.
Got it. Yeah.
And it was really fucking painful, right? Because like I took it personally. I felt like there was something wrong with me. I felt shame in not being desirable. I shared with you and a couple of girlfriends that this was going on, but many people did not know. I mean, we gave the impression that we were a very attractive couple, very progressive, polyamorous, and had it all together.
Yeah, I just want to back up for a second. I think I just felt something break open when you were talking about him telling you, that he was criticizing or saying he didn't feel seen, he didn't feel heard, he didn't feel like you listened to him. And I think this is the fear really that people have, even if they don't know it, that like talking about sex and intimacy is going to lead to deeper, harder shit. And it absolutely does. We're just here to tell you that you're right.
Yes, you are right. You're right.
And it's
because also he felt shame in his lack of desire. It wasn't like he was like, hey, check box, this is how I'm feeling today. See you, he was like, it was really hard.
Yeah. But this is the thing is that, yes, you're opening a box and you're like, by talking to your partner about intimacy and sex, you are actually opening a much bigger box. But it leads to a more genuine connection or disconnection, depending, but it leads to something more honest. And I just want to emphasize that. And it's uncomfortable as fuck, but it's definitely, it's ultimately more pure, more conscious.
Yeah. And I would say, I agree with all of that. And, so we, that was what he shared, but it wasn't like, okay, that means we're never having sex again. It was, okay, like this is where we're at. It's where he was at in that moment. So we're going to keep working on it. Right. So we spent years continuing, we continued to see a therapist for a little while. And then we like moved on to other things, which I'll talk about, of like tantra retreats and things like that, to try to figure out how to resolve this. And I definitely had 100% confidence that as like two grown, mature adults, good communicators,
Right.
smart, like we would figure this out, right?
Yeah.
Um,
So let's break this down. He came to you and shared this. And how did you respond? How did you receive that information? And what granularly, what did that conversation look like?
I definitely cried. Definitely tears.
Yeah. Wow.
And there's I would also say it wasn't like in my mind, to be honest, like it's not like it was like, just like one conversation. Like it was like, okay, over time. And I'm actually now remembering it was actually with the guidance of our talk therapist who suggested, why don't we just take a break for a
Mm.
month of Janelle not initiating sex, right?
Oh yeah, I remember that.
Yes.
Remember you saying, nope, no initiating for me. I'm not initiating.
Yes. No, yes, exactly. So that was her suggestion to us. And um, we only had sex one more time after that in the following years.
Wow.
Yeah. Like she gave us
How
a
was
container of 1 month. Yeah. And so, but in that way, like that was she, she was like trying to help us guide like the energetic piece of it. So again, having a third party can be very
Yeah,
useful if like you're really
absolutely.
in the trenches about this stuff. And so this was her way of helping navigate energetically that he felt like the way he did, whatever, however that wants to be
Mm-hmm.
described, and that I was the one who was like initiating and wanting it. So she said, "How about you just, take a month long break of Janelle, you stop initiating."
Mm-hmm.
And and I will also say we actually didn't continue going to see the therapist, after that as well. We were kind of like, we felt like complete and done with her
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
simultaneously that was happening.
Mm-hmm. Well, I just want to honor that, just that small change that you made. Like, it might not have been a positive result, but it did shift things, right?
Hmm.
How did it feel not to initiate? Like, was it hard? Was it like, what was that like for you not to initiate sex?
It was hard. I mean, back to that initial question of like who initiated, it was me. And so to realize, oh, I'm the one who's always initiating. And there was a part of me that felt very stifled, right?
Mm-hmm.
That I couldn't express, I couldn't be myself.
Yeah.
And as I dug deeper again over time, the more we worked on this, and the more like skills I learned, and the education I got in from tantra through about pleasure and intimacy, I really learned to just I can say now that was my only way of expressing this particular flavor of energy that I had. And I
Mm.
don't it's not true for me that way anymore. But it's
So you're saying initiating sex was the only way to express this particular flavor
right,
of
like,
you.
because this is how I wanted to feel close to him.
Right.
Or,
But you're saying now,
rather, let me rephrase that. I wanted to feel close to him, and this is the way I knew to do that. Like, this is how it felt close, like, right? Like, I could feel close to him in a long processing conversation, but actually, like,
yeah,
cuddled on the couch, making out, like, just like being juicy and warm in our embrace was much more nourishing to me. So
right. Okay, so this was your inclination. And it sounds like by having, I mean, even though it's like 4 years between, or it took a long time, you had this conversation. Do you feel now that there are different ways to express that same flavor of you?
yes. And I would say I just have learned so much about myself, and, like, in a sense, just so much clearer on what my desires are, what my boundaries are. And so the thing I want to kind of maybe come back to in this moment is I really want to give my ex-husband a tremendous amount of acknowledgement and respect for having that conversation with me, because what I now would say is that if we had continued having sex, it would have been fine. And I would have been okay with fine because it would have fit my category of like, oh, I'm married and at least we're having sex.
Oh my God, mic drop. Just stop there. Like, if you would have kept having sex, it would have been fine. Because it would have looked like it was supposed to look.
Yeah.
Would have checked the box.
Yep. And so I would have been like, oh, I have nothing to complain about. Right? Like I wouldn't have gone deeper into like, what are my desires and my longings? And in all honesty, right, this is one of the things that helped me get to that for the two of us, like come to the point of like, oh, divorce is correct for us. But this is like the most extreme thing. If we had been having sex a little bit, I don't know that I would have been able to break this huge fucking barrier around divorce in my mind, right? Like, but not having sex was such an extreme thing that I was able to be like, no, well, that doesn't feel exactly aligned. But, and so on that journey, as we're talking about, like bringing it back to the question of how do we talk to our partners about sex and intimacy, is he demonstrated what it's like to honor his own boundaries and his own desires in the face of my disappointment and my tears and hurting the person he loved the most in the world.
Wow. Wow. So we hear a lot about boundaries, and to be honest, I hear so much in the world about like someone else in the world crossing my boundaries, right? It's always in terms of the other. It's not in terms of ourselves. But I've learned this in the last few years that, and a large part after talking to you about like, oh, I was crossing my own boundary again.
Right.
Because it's a practice, right? So he was honoring his own boundaries and saying no, even though he wasn't making you happy, even though he knew that you might be upset, even though he knew you were crying, because he was staying in alignment with himself.
Correct. And that was like in that moment, super painful. And then years later, I could see that was a huge gift. And where I got to was I eventually got to see where I was crossing my own boundaries, when I was like, oh, I actually, after contemplating and trying all different types of checking different boxes and opening my mind to what relationships could look like and all these different things, being like settling on the fact that I was like, oh, I really want to have sex with my primary partner. That's important to me. And so staying in the relationship when that wasn't available through no fault of anyone's, right? Like he was like, this isn't what I desire. And I was like, oh, and this is what I desire. Now we're just here we are in the truth of ourselves. Now what do we do?
And so let's just lay out for the Bravehearts that part of the resolution here was honoring your own boundaries. What are the reasons that someone might not honor their own boundary?
Because you don't want to hurt the person you love. Because you don't value your own boundary. Like you don't think whatever it is that you want, what you desire is important enough, legitimate enough. It could be that you don't think you deserve it. There's a whole bunch of reasons why we can cross our own boundaries and not honor them.
Yeah. And so getting back to the question, like, how do you talk to your partner about intimacy and sex is, can you go into this conversation knowing what your boundaries are?
And or at least acknowledging I mean, Bravehearts, if you've been on this journey with us, you know how often Andrea and I would start every sentence for a long time of he said, he wants, he did this, right? And then we would remind each other, okay, like start with I. I want, like, can
Nope.
you
Nope.
come back to yourself?
Back
Come
to
back
you.
to yourself.
Back to you.
And
Woo, so challenging.
so this
You did it
journey,
to me yesterday. Yesterday.
yeah.
Yeah.
So in talking about sex and intimacy, really it is a practice of coming back to what it is that I want, and can you stand in the discomfort of wanting what you want and speaking it,
Yes.
and not blaming the other person. Blaming is a sure sign that something's a little bit off there. And
Yeah.
yeah.
I think we're making talking about sex and intimacy with your partner sound really hard. I'm so sorry, Bravehearts. You should still do it. This is how you should do it, but it's not. We didn't say it's not going to be awkward. You should embrace the awkwardness.
Yes. Yes.
It's going to be hard.
And but I do, like, and we've got a whole other thing to talk about here, but it is going to be hard. But I am such a stand for, or my experience has been, my pleasure has been a path towards my freedom, it's brought me home to myself. And so that required me learning about my own desires, my own pleasure, and then speaking those. And that's actually a gift that happens in relationship, right? Like it's, like not that everyone has to be married, but like when you are relating to someone else and being in conversation and in relationship around these topics of sex and intimacy, they are a very potent way, and potent and painful, but way to the joy and freedom that I feel now.
Okay. Okay. So what happened next on your journey?
So I mentioned that talk therapy, eventually just like kind of, we run our course with it. And along the way, we were introduced to Tantra and started going to Tantra retreats. And my husband and I at this point had not had sex in a long time. Maybe more than a year. I don't exactly know. But when someone had recommended a Tantra retreat, I jumped at the chance. I was aware that there was something there for me, without having actually any idea what Tantra was, any idea what this retreat was going to be about.
Something sexual, right? Something sexual.
And I was like, yes. And I did think I was going to have sex. So I was like, okay, I'm in. Right. And on the very first day of this retreat, we did an exercise where our mind spoke to our bodies and our bodies spoke to our minds. And it was like a conversation between these two parts of ourselves. And
that's even confusing, I think, for some, like, what does that mean? For people who've been living in their minds? Like, I was definitely living in my mind for a very long time. And I wouldn't even know what you meant by that.
Yeah, that's a great point. I didn't either.
Okay.
That, like, I didn't know at the time, but now what I can say is, our mind has been conditioned by family, by culture, by religion, by movie, by Disney, by culture,
By our parents.
And our bodies actually have a lot to say, but we're not taught to listen to our bodies. And I would say that is this big aha that came to me, is like, our bodies are the source of wisdom that are, it can be, not always, but can be very quiet and subtle, whereas our minds can be very loud. So it can take quiet to listen to to hear what our body has to say. And this was a huge turning point for me in my journey, was that I learned actually what my body wanted. And I learned that what it wanted was different than what my mind was telling me I should want.
Yeah, I think just, if you're familiar with listening to your body, I feel like I can tap into it, but is there a practice that, that puts you into your body on a regular basis, Janelle? Or like, how do you flex and maintain that muscle of listening to the body when the mind is so loud?
What I want to talk about is like on that same retreat, right, where we
Yeah.
actually have the chance to practice, to embody these lessons that we're learning. We got to practice with other people essentially. And there was someone I was really attracted to and felt comfortable and easy with. So he and I set up a time to practice some of these skills that we had learned. And we moved really slowly. And I asked him and I say I moved really slowly, it was like, like you come together, you kiss, and you have this idea of in the movies, and there's all this energy and everything's so sexy, and then and instead it was like, nope, we're just moving, like just moving really slowly, touching ourselves really slowly. And the invitation for each other, based on the learnings that we'd gotten, was to move slowly and to keep checking in. So I asked him to just keep checking in with me to see if I was present during this interaction. Mm-hmm. And some people might notice that they dissociate in this situation. I didn't feel that I was dissociating, but what I found was that I was going into my head and having a conversation with myself, right? Like, here's a person right here, but I'm actually in my head having a conversation with myself.
Tell me about that conversation.
That he is not part of at all.
Yeah, because I think I can relate. But like, what do you mean? Like, what conversation were you having in your head?
I was just like, oh, does he like this? Like, are we moving too slowly? Oh, like I wonder, are my toes cold? Like, what's like?
Oh my God, it's so funny. Like, yeah, just thinking about how much my mind has been in charge.
Yes. And so what I had asked him was like, can you just ask me a question like every 10 minutes? Like, are you here? And so at one point he asked me that, and I was like, oh, I'm not really, like, I'm in my head. I'm not like fully present with you and my body and like what's going on. Mm-hmm. And what I also realized is that what the other part of the conversation that was happening in my head was, are we going to have sex? Are we going to have sex?
Right.
And as we moved very slowly and we were communicating, what I heard my body say to me was, I don't want sex. What I want is eye gazing and making out.
Yay.
Yay. And I was like, oh. And like tying back into like the first part of this conversation is like, how do you define sex and intimacy? I had been defining sex as intimacy, and like that's what I wanted with my husband. But I had really like not taken into consideration that we were also not making out and eye gazing and being really present with one another, and that's actually what felt way more intimate to me.
Yeah.
So in this way, Bravehearts, if you don't know how you define sex and intimacy, right? Or you're like, it's a journey, but it took me a while to figure it all out, but at least you have the question to start with. Like, it took me a long time to ask the question.
Yeah. So I'm hearing, what I hear is that you really had to work out the different voices from your mind and from your body and how they're telling you different things. Mm-hmm. Now, does this mean that during sex, so I want to tie this back to talking to your partner about intimacy and sex. Mm-hmm. And what I'm hearing also is that like, I need to figure out what my mind and my body are saying. Should Bravehearts do that before they talk to their partner about sex and intimacy?
I mean, in a perfect world, sure, but that might take a
Right.
really long
Can you?
time. too.
Yeah.
So I want to set us all up for success too.
Right.
So I guess this is the important lesson of that I want Bravehearts to take away from this is that just to know that the body has wisdom that's different than the mind, and that it's worth listening to.
Okay.
And some of the ways to listen to your body is alone time and moving slowly. This whole series that we're about to do is how to talk to my partner about sex and intimacy. But I don't actually believe that everything is just about being in the head, right? And so one of the things you can do as part of I want to talk about sex and intimacy with you is let's try things about how can we be in our bodies together, right? So that we can learn for ourselves what actually feels true and not. So like in this way that, you know, an example could be where you're just going to spend 15 minutes moving really slowly, pausing, tuning in with yourself, and then tuning in with the other, right? And at the end of those 15 minutes, have a conversation about what you just experienced. And that's still talking about sex and intimacy. And the book that I would recommend that can be also very, very useful in this realm of things is, and I've talked about her many times, is The Art of Receiving and Giving by Betty Martin. And she talks about the wheel of consent. And this book really goes into, there's something called the 3-minute game where you can be learning about what it is that you want and be asking about it. And she talks about how to like notice your body and then trust what your body's telling you and then to value what your body's telling you and then communicate it. So we'll go more in depth into that particular concept in another episode, but it's a good homework assignment.
Okay. So yeah, that's the Braveheart homework. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that if you want to start with a book, then that's definitely the book for Braveheart homework. But if you also just want to spend some time talking to yourself and then talking to your partner about your definition of sex and intimacy and the examples of when have you felt like this is actually what, you know, there's an unstated, but I'm now going to state invitation to broaden your definition of what sex is. And beyond just orgasm, beyond penetration, beyond like the boxes that we've put them in.
Yeah.
And the same thing for intimacy. When is it that you felt really connected to your partner and the examples of those? And then set a date and sit down and talk to your partner about it. And if you're single, then also just have the conversation with yourself.
Yeah, fascinating. Wow. Thank you. Thank you, friend, for being so vulnerable and sharing your journey with us.
I'm excited. I'm excited to ask you the same questions next week.
Next week it'll be me.
Yeah.
I can't wait. Oh my God. Okay, Bravehearts, we love you.
We love you. It feels great to be back. And yeah, so for the next 3 months, how to talk to your partner about sex and intimacy. We're diving deep.
Hey, Bravehearts, looking for permission? Work with us. We offer Braveheart coaching. Follow us on Instagram. Meet us in real life at a Braveheart conversation. Subscribe to our newsletter. Do all this and more at our website, permissiontobehuman.live.